her in a moment, as this is an important budget presentation. As is tradition, I'll begin with the presentation, provide some slides, give you an update on where we are. This, again, the May revise of our 2022-2023 budget. Keeley and the finance team, HD and others, will be available to answer any questions after we exhaust a number of questions that perhaps you have directly of me. So let's just jump right in. An update with the May revision. Our balanced budget includes a $300.7 billion investment, $227.4 in the general fund. Just so folks have a sense of where this is compared to the January budget. It's about 5% higher total budget, about 15.4% above where we were in January just on the general fund, which is not an insignificant move in just a matter of months. Total reserves in this budget plan, $37.1 billion. The rainy day fund deposits now about $7.5 billion higher than it was last year, $23.3 billion. You can see investments that we're not only making as it relates to the budget today, but you'll see when you review the actual budget plan, that rainy day reserve over the forecast period gets to just shy of $30 billion, $29.6 billion. We'll talk more about reserves and fiscal discipline. I will note, though, the rainy day fund deposit reaches the 10% constitutional cap. In fact, there is about a precisely $476 million spillover that will end up in our infrastructure investments pursuant to the rules and regulations that we are constrained under. As it relates to retirement liabilities, this is a slide that the last few years you've seen is quite familiar, something I'm deeply concerned about, deeply focused on. I should note, just looking at the latest numbers, now these numbers will dramatically change as they trail a little bit of the market activity and the volatility we've experienced, the NASDAQ and S&P and Dow. I should note that PERS is currently at 80.7% funded. Shortfall still of $43.6 billion. That's a significant number. It's a number we need to stay focused on as a state. So when we talk about balanced budgets, we talk about fiscal discipline, always must be mindful as it relates to retirement obligations. On STRS, the state responsibility is about $13 billion, and STRS a little bit outperformed a little bit in terms of where their funded status is at about 81.9%. I say all that and may be confusing to some, but I really want to reinforce a framework of focus as it relates to dealing with our long-term obligations. And that includes not just retirement benefits, traditional sense, but unfunded healthcare liabilities as well. And that's what's reflected in this slide. You'll see just in the last few years, $12.7 billion has been invested in this space. The next few years, supplemental payments will be made, $3.4 billion this year, additional supplemental payments to pay down those liabilities. And you'll see over the forecast period an additional $7.6 billion. Here's the number you've been waiting for, this surplus. Projected operating surplus for the state of California in the May revisions, just shy of $100 billion, simply without precedent. No other state in American history has ever experienced a surplus as large as this. In fact, this is actually significantly larger than last year's operating surplus, around $75.6 billion. 75.6 was significant. That, by the way, didn't include the $27 billion from the federal government. I see a lot of conflation as it relates to surpluses with federal funds. This does not reflect that. The $97.5 billion does, however, reflect constraints as it relates to Prop 2, Prop 98. So the discretionary surplus is closer to $49.2 billion, but $97.5 billion operating surplus. I think it's important to highlight, and as I was noting, as it relates to the issue of volatility, this slide. This is an important slide, and let me give it a little bit of context. You look at capital gains, and that's where a lot of the volatility comes from. Capital gains is a share of personal income taxes in the state of California, going back to 2000. And if you don't remember 2000, maybe you remember 1999, 2000, what happened right after 99, 2000? as it relates to the dot-com boom, bust. Percentage of capital gains, percentage of personal income was 10.4%. You look back to 1976. It's interesting, a little historic average, 1976 to the present. The capital gains as a percentage of personal income in the state of California has averaged 5.04%, a little over 5%. You can see what happened in 2000. 2021, that's an asterisk for one reason. This is what we project, 9.7%. So if you want to mirror caution, this is the slide that I think is that reflective mirror. The question is, what would they have done in the state of California finance and the legislature, knowing what was going to come in late 2000, 2001, 2003, if they knew the economic realities, the macroeconomic realities, the markets and the volatility that was going to ensue and all the cuts that had to come from that. And so we've been very mindful of that. For those that are concerned about that, they're right to be concerned about that. We are deeply mindful of that. And that is not only reflected in terms of this slide, but it's also reflected in terms of this, arguably even more important slide, that the one-time spending, meaning not obligating ourselves to multi-year investments, our one-time spending, remarkably, just for the May revise, the increment from January, 99% of that surplus we are proposing to the legislature, and again, mindful always of this being a proposal to the legislature, 99% to be one-time spending. If you true that up with the budget we put out in January, which reflected about 86%, which was historically near the high 80s, 90, we are looking at a budget with the blend, 94% of all of our surplus invested now in one-time projects, one-time proposals. So this is important, and I hope folks understand why we're doing it, and I look forward to working with the legislature and their respective staff to discuss, I think, the imperative of caution, particularly at this moment, and what more caution do we need in terms of evidence than the last 2 weeks, the markets and the volatility and the bear markets that at least 3 of the 4 major indexes are currently in. As it relates to the larger issues that presented today in the budget, you've become familiar with many of the themes. Perhaps the most important thing right now in people's minds, understandably, is how do I lower costs? With high inflation, record inflation, at least in our lifetimes, the challenges and burdens associated with costs across the spectrum. What are we going to do to ease that stress, ease that burden? And that's why we're proposing $18.1 billion to put back in the pockets of millions and millions, tens of millions of Californians. $18.1 billion back in the pockets of Californians. Let's talk about how we look to structure that and what we are proposing. You're familiar with our proposal of a number of months ago, proposals that you've seen that are not competing. I think they're incredibly complementary. And I want to applaud and thank the legislature, both the Assembly and the Senate, 2 different proposals, not competing, complementary proposals as it relates to refunds to the people of the state of California. I should note our proposal is about $11.5 billion in terms of direct relief, direct payments back into the pockets of taxpayers in the state. Legislature has ones, a few $1 billion less, and they approach things in terms of how you distribute the money slightly differently from us. I have all the confidence in the world we'll be able to square those modest differences, and we'll come around to a number and a strategy that's in the best interests of Californians. My interest is to get the money out as quickly as possible. People are feeling deep stress, deep anxiety. You see that reflected in recent gas prices now beginning to go back up. Our rebate is across the spectrum. For you, it could be a rebate to address the issue of groceries. It could be a rebate to address the other cost burdens are placed on you. It's a simple tax refund. It could be a gas refund. Whatever it is, it's inflation refund and relief, $11.5 billion. By the way, I'd be remiss. We are in the process of still distributing a modest amount left, mindful, a modest amount. But we did something a year ago called the Golden State Stimulus. It's the largest tax rebate in U.S. history. We have distributed just over $9 billion to 12 12.9 million households. 12.9 million households have received anywhere from $600 to $2,200, the largest tax rebate in U.S. history. We want to build off that. And so I want to put that in perspective. We're talking about north of $20 billion of tax refunds back to back, if you look at the two calendar years or two fiscal years in terms of what we're proposing. I think that's important, and that's something I want to remind people of what we just did and what we are proposing moving forward. We're also proposing, as it relates to lowering costs, addressing the issues and burdens associated with rent. You know well, the federal government provided us rental assistance. That program capped out, and that program has billions and billions of dollars of requests that cannot be met with federal money. We're looking to use a portion of our surplus and provide an additional $2.7 billion for an $8.1 billion total program to address the rental anxieties that so many Californians face. I should note, you see that line below, 300,000 plus families have been assisted, and you see the focus on very low-income Californians that obviously are facing not only the stress as it relates to the last 2 years in the pandemic, but the stress associated with higher costs. So that's an important proposal and one that directly goes to the pockets of those most in need. In addition, and I want to thank so many members of the legislature for their strong advocacy and support, and Senator Dodd more recently just on the issue of water and the ability for people to pay for water, let alone access water associated with safe drinking crisis and access to safe drinking water in our state. We are looking to provide an additional $1.4 billion to help people pay their electric bills, to pay their utility bills. This builds off the $2 billion, the $2 billion that we had already approved. So in addition to the two, we want to provide an additional $1.4 billion in relief for people that are having a difficult time addressing the issue of increased costs associated with their utilities. I also am very mindful of the stress and the burden. It's, I think, National Healthcare Workers Week and Nurses Week in America, should be every day, of the stress that's been placed on our healthcare workforce, particularly nursing home staffs and hospital staff. And we're looking to provide stipends because we're losing staff. I was with the head of the Hospital Association just 48 hours ago, raising the alarm bells. 20+% of their workforce, she estimated, has turned over. It's a real recruitment challenge, and that will be made worse if we don't focus on retention. And that's why we're looking at these additional stipends, and that's reflected in the $933 million. We also, as you know, as part of our relief package, believe that we can do more to support and bolster public transit in the state of California. And that's why we want to get more people back on the bus, more people back on the trains, and remind them of the importance of that invested infrastructure. And that's $750 million reflected there in free public transit. Additional efforts in that $18.1 billion package include, and I think this is important, good people can disagree, but the small business men and women, I've met, how many of us, I don't want to go down to all the people I've met, but tens of thousands of people over the last few years that I've had the pleasure and privilege of meeting, many one-on-one group settings. The issue associated with diesel is often forgotten. And we have huge diesel cost increases and a lot of small businessmen and women that are struggling. And we're looking to pause an increase in that sales tax, or rather pause the sales tax portion that comes to the general fund to address the increased burdens on many of them. That's reflected in this package. $304 million is reflected in the fact that the federal government made a promotion, made a promise, they initiated it, and now with everything that's stuck, they're pulling back. You may recall in 2019, we became the first state in the U.S. to provide subsidies to the middle class, deepened subsidies for folks below 400% of federal poverty, and expanded subsidies, people 400 to 600% of federal poverty. That's a fancy way of saying middle class so often are forgotten in terms of relief. We are looking to do what has just sunsetted from the federal government. They provided an offset to what we had initiated. We're going to go back to our original form and our original strategy. I think maybe the first, maybe now the only state to provide, maybe, this kind of relief for the middle class. And you see the individual will benefit. There's almost $3,800+ and families, works out, if a family of four, it's $621 a month. $621 subsidy a month. That annualizes over $7,400 just in that subsidy. We also feel very strongly working families on child care need support, and you can see savings up to almost $600 a month for we estimate as 40,000 families reflected in fee waivers for child care. I want to thank the Women's Caucus, been incredible on this across the spectrum of issues, but in particular pointed around family fee waivers, and I want to acknowledge tip of hat to their advocacy reflected in this budget. Talk about building California. We got to talk about rebuilding the state, infrastructure. And we are very mindful of the work we have to do across the spectrum, not only in terms of deferred maintenance, but on investing in the future. Old saw says if you don't invest in the future, you're not going to do very well there. And so we think this budget will push us in the direction that all of you deserve, and that's a significant increase in our infrastructure investments. You saw in January, $20 billion proposal. We're adding an additional $17 billion in the May revision on energy, on infrastructure, TK to 16. Again, it's no longer K to 12. It's TK to 16. Drought, water, housing, homeless, you see broadband. We could talk a little bit about. That's dealing with the middle mile and extending beyond the $6 billion we put in that space. This is an additional $1.1 billion from last year, and I noted more deferred maintenance money. We also are looking, again, in the spirit of that earlier slide, on the capital gains slide, and being fiscally prudent and investing wisely. We're looking to pay down obligations, lease revenue obligations, looking at callable GO bonds to avoid future interest costs and projected savings, just for example, on 2.7 of the 6.2 we're proposing in terms of reducing our long-term debt obligations just by shifting capital projects from those lease revenue to cash is an example, I think, of good fiscal management and stewardship. When you're enjoying a surplus like this, we think it's wise to convert those obligations by using that cash, reducing long-term obligations, providing more flexibility, as this will, into the future. As it relates to the future, there's no foundation more important to building that future than addressing the issue of affordability as it relates to housing in the state. Just briefly, I want to go through this few slides on housing. A lot of that was covered in the January budget, substantially and comprehensively so in the last few budgets. More on that in a moment. But you'll see the $2.5 billion reflected in the January and May package. The specifics on the May component, that's the $500 million, is around what we refer to, forgive the language, adapted reuse. That's government speak for converting things like office buildings, malls, and others to housing. And it's interesting, there's been a lot of conversation and thrust of focus, and I think it's an incredibly important debate here in Sacramento, the state, this nation, as it relates to the changing nature of retail. You have all these extraordinary malls, all that open space, just the parking lots themselves that are now open and vacant, and of course, these remarkable vestiges to a world that is radically changing, the old shopping mall, and so we want to look to see what we can do in terms of converting them as many office buildings as well into housing. So that's reflected in that $500 million, and it builds off what we put in the package in January, $1.5 billion specifically just in that space. I'll remind you just briefly, and not all of them, but I noted a lot of this in January. Accountability. Not just about writing checks, not just about more is better is better. And so we created this new housing accountability unit. I just picked up the morning paper virtually, and I saw a mayor down in Atherton who knows a lot about this housing accountability unit, and because, we're dialing things up as it relates to accountability. Because if we don't address the issue of the housing demand supply imbalance, we're as dumb as we want to be. This is why some folks are moving. They can't afford it. It's not just taxes. In many respects, it's not taxes. I'll remind everybody, just because it's an editorial opportunity. For middle-class families, taxes in places like Texas are higher than taxes in the state of California, 3.8% higher, to be exact, in one recent study. But housing prices are a big driver. And so we've got to address this issue. And so we've been driving. We created that Housing Accountability Unit. Thank you to members of the legislature for holding strong on that last year. 17 housing-related CEQA bills, 17. People say you need to address the issue. Well, we're moving in, but we're doing it not to, but with a lot of our partners and building strategies and partnerships. I have more work to do in that space together. And then, of course, the investments on tax credits across the spectrum, infill grants and the like, $7.25 billion just in the last few years of new investments. And all of that's around this new RENA goal, that RENA goal that everybody's so excited about, the sixth cycle RENA goal that goes through, I think, 2030. In that new sixth cycle RENA goal, we pushed hard to make sure SCAG and others, and again, if any of you are paying attention, you didn't understand any of that. SCAG, sixth cycle RENA goal through 2030. It's just a fancy way of saying planning process to make real what we promote, and that's housing. You identify the housing, tell us how you're going to get it done. We'll find more supports than ever to help you. We're going to hold you accountable as we provide those supports. The new goal is 2.5 million units, which is higher than it's been, certainly in the fifth cycle, fourth cycle. We are leaning in hard on all this, as we are in terms of addressing that conveyor belt, which is not just the conveyor belt for talent we often refer to as our institutions of higher learning, but TK to 12. This reflects, and Keely can correct me, I think $19.6 billion more of investments than was reflected in the January budget. That's a number you've never seen in California. $128.3 billion investment. That's all funds. Just on Prop 98 alone, you've never seen a number like this. $110.3 billion, Prop 98 investments. 110.3, substantially higher than that January number. Look how this reflects. We all talked about one day, just imagine, $20,000 per pupil. Well, we're at $22,000, almost $23,000 total investments per pupil. Some say, well, that's misleading. What about the Prop 98? Well, getting closer, 17,000 per pupil investments. Compare that to just 7,000 a decade ago. So, I mean, this is just order of magnitude. And again, it's not just about spending money, it's what you spend money on. And I just want to remind you, because I think it's worthy of being reminded. You know, I see some of these governors out there, their big idea of education reform is what you can't say in a classroom. Talking about something that doesn't exist, or banning books because they use the word social and emotional. I mean, it's comedic, and that's what all the time and attention goes to. That's not education, period, let alone reform. This is education reform. This is about completely reimagining the public education system. We created, with the legislature, a brand new grade. Thank you, Kevin McCarty, everybody who was out there working hard. We did it last year. We're implementing that whole new grade. Summer and after school. How many years they've been talking about that up here in the state of California? Finally did it. 4.8 billion reasons why that is happening. In fact, you're going to see some more money in a few slides later because we want to accelerate that effort. That's 9 hours of enrichment per day. That's reform. That's happening in real time, reducing class size. All the experts, you put them all in one room, they say, what do you need to do? That's the list. Special education, $3.1 billion, $3.1 billion we've invested just in the last few years. Another $500 million we're asking the legislature for from the January budget. Teacher hire and recruitment, $2.9 billion. Professional development and support, $1.9 billion just in the college savings accounts. And I'll just remind you, because this is exciting, never been done anywhere. 3.5 million of our kids this July are going to get college savings accounts in their name. What percentage of their parents don't have access to checking and savings accounts? Because of the legislature's strong advocacy, Assemblyman, is there everybody that supported this program? $2 billion of college savings accounts going to be set up in a matter of weeks. No state's ever done that. That's creating a college-going mindset at an early age also creates a tool for financial literacy, wealth creation, not just income. It's a complete paradigm shift in terms of how we can use those accounts to build partnerships, capacity, and understanding and opportunity. And that's happening. The Universal Meals Program, we're going to talk about that in a moment. We're going to get up to $1.2 billion investment. No state in America has made an investment like that. And my wife's here, and thank her for her strong advocacy. Senator Skinner has just been extraordinary in this space. So it's philanthropy, stepping up. That doesn't even include the $450 million we're using for capital investments to get those kitchens going so we can get fresh food and provide more partnerships with our ag partners. So that's exciting. That's why we call it transforming public education. These will take some years, but this is what we've been doing last couple of years, and we're funding these things. We're not just promoting it, we're investing in them, and you can see that reflected in these new investments in May. $8 billion for flexible block grants. Now this goes to the issue of what are you doing about that learning loss? What are you going to do about more high-dose tutoring or the needs for high-dose tutoring? What are you going to do in terms of flexibility? We need flexibility. $8 billion of new investments for flexible block grants. People say, well, hold on. You had a January budget, showed about 5.7 million people you projected would be enrolled in the next fiscal year. It looks now to be about 5.5. That declining enrollment, which is not unique to California, it's happened all across this country. How do you help soften the blow of that funding or lack thereof coming to locals? Well, here's what we've done. We added $2.1 billion to address declining enrollment, but we changed the formula. We listened. In January, we put out a proposal to do a blend of the last 3 years. People said that's good, at least 2 of the last 3 years, but there was that 1 year because of COVID where that decline wasn't necessarily a real average. And so we acknowledge that, and so we're blending a more appropriate average, we think, that's more reflective of that decline, but we're basically softening that impact. That's the 2.1 million. Everybody said, well, that's nice, your 5.33% LCFF COLA. That was January. You can see the LCFF COLA is 6.56, which I know some of the education advocates just heard that. I know, 6.56. That's a number we haven't seen. But they said, what about the base increase? And that's reflected as well, the 2.1 billion right above it. In community schools, I can't believe we're doing this at the scale we're doing it. I remember out there on the campaign just talking about how we can do community schools, which is just about taking down silos, making schools part of the community, connecting dots, taking fences down, literally, not just, figuratively. $3 billion working with the legislature. So much credit they deserve to do community schools last year, and we're putting another $1.5 billion. Why? Because we're getting all of the big ideas coming back to us, all the grants, all the applications, and they're so exciting, but they've exceeded our appropriation. And so we want to continue to build that momentum and those partnerships in the spirit of something that should have happened decades ago, and that is bringing the community, bringing not just parents, but parents, and the larger community, the libraries, park playgrounds, everything, and bringing that whole person focus to our public education system. We also, as I noted in the May revise, we're truing up to that that's the 1.2 billion, is reflected in the 600 million plus what we did in January, getting to 1.2 billion on school meals, doing more for residencies for counselors, school counselors and teachers, building on a lot of that work we were doing in previous years. You can see the acceleration that I was referring to as it relates to summer and after school. And then you could see more investment in STEM professional development. Don't think for a second we are not disciplined in that space, but we also believe in STEAM, not STEM, and that's the A that's missing, arts and music. And you say, well, 63 million is nice, but remember the January budget. You add up the January and May budget, $1 billion of new investments we're proposing for the legislature in arts and music. We also are mindful that we need to do more in terms of facilities. You have Prop 51, you may recall, running out of money. It was the last school bond that was passed. We're going to appropriate $1.4 billion of the remaining. That's the rest of that bond, $1.4 million. It's not reflected here. But we're going to increase the general fund contributions by an additional $1.8 billion in May for capital. By the way, another, it's not in here, $1.8 billion for deferred maintenance. Again, not reflected, coincidental, 1.8 for deferred maintenance, 1.8 for capital, in addition to the dollars you see here. That provides, just to give you a sense, there's a lot of schools, 1,050 plus schools, districts in the state, rather. We want to spread that out. 1.8 billion sounds like a lot, but it's a minimum of 100,000 per district. So even the smallest districts are going to look for opportunity north of 100,000. As it relates to opportunities, as I said, no greater, nothing like it. Institutions of higher learning here in the state of California, no greater, conveyor belt for opportunity and dreams than our CSUs, UCs, and community colleges. What we've missed in the past is a collective goal, a vision. Everybody's been, running around. You had the master plan decades ago, but we never had an attainment goal for the entire state. We've changed that. Working with those institutions of higher learning, we came up with this degree completion goal of 70%. So we've established a new goal, but we established it with the systems. Here's the exciting part. We put together this, what we call Partnership for Achievement, this memorandum of broader understanding. Those are technical words, but basically put together a package working very directly with CSU, UC, and community college to align not only the systems themselves, but our own broader goals, legislative goals, and state goals to address the deeper and systemic issues around equity, degree completion, time to degree, transparency, increasing enrollment for in-state students as well. And we put all that out, and we have a new framework. And we're going to fund that framework. Historic investments, multi-year, so they can plan. The biggest problem is the episodic nature of the budgeting, and so they can't plan for the future. And that's why we're committing a multi-year 5% base increase. That's substantially higher than some of the 2, 3, 0% you've seen or cuts in the past. And we think this will be a game changer. In fact, we see that reflected in a lot of the enthusiasm, gentle enthusiasm at the UC Regents and obviously with the trustees and board members of the community college. All of that is built off what we did together. And I, again, want to just thank the legislature. We put $2 billion out last year to address the underlying causes of increased costs. So much is around how do we subsidize those costs versus how do we address the reasons why costs are so high. So we did 2 years free at community college. We put $2 billion for more student housing. And by the way, that is looking to get oversubscribed as well as applications are coming in. We provided more scholarship support for Cal Grants. Interesting, we've got some issues, particularly community college, where decline in enrollment may not be as much as 170,000, might be closer to 110, but nonetheless, more Cal Grant opportunities. And here's the big one. It's an important number. I've mentioned this, a lot of my friends, they said, I don't believe that. 37,000 more slots just in the last couple of years. UC and CSU slots. The ones that believe it are the ones that got their kids in. The ones that don't, the ones that didn't get their kids in, which I get. It's hard. We're a few years off from that, and I'm already stressed about it. No influence, however. So look at the May investments building off. Well, forgive me. I'll go back on the higher education. We look forward, as an example, and I'll just close on this one example. I saw, Dr. Drake runs the UC system, and his goal, the goal of the UC is to have a debt-free experience. And they codified that in our partnership by 2030, just in a few years. And they're already driving. Policy discussions are changing because of this new framework and engagement. And again, I'm just enthusiastic about it. Maybe it's my time as Lieutenant Governor spending on both those boards, but it's a point of real pride, and I know envy of every governor in this country, and for that matter, every leader around the world, our remarkable system of higher education. We need to cherish it, we need to invest in it, and we're doing that. We also need to cherish our entrepreneurs and those that make investments in our state. And that's what we will continue to do. And let me just briefly go through some of these. We're going to add an additional $500 million for grants, not loans, for small businesses. The conformity, which is a fancy word for tax conformity, conforming with the federal tax code around those PPP loans. And remember those paycheck protection loans, and you can get a tax write-off. It's complicated. And we're doing another $450 million because there's 2 months that wasn't covered in the last conformity package, which was $6.2 billion. Again, if you're listening to me, you have to be confused. But all those numbers are accurate. The diesel tax, which I reference, which again, I focused as a small business relief because I really believe it to be disproportionately so. And then I want to thank Karen and our team to really focus on the issue of businesses notably impacted because of water and drought and scarcity. A lot of ag businesses, and it's not just talking about small farmers themselves, though we do record amount of investments in that space, but how about the person that warehouses some of the fruit and vegetables? And because the land was fallow, doesn't have the ability to warehouse, and his business has been impacted. And that's why you're seeing this $75 million increase in terms of supporting those ancillary businesses, as well as small ag businesses that are directly being impacted by the drought. I'll remind everybody of what we did together. This is big. Thank you to the Speaker, Speaker Rendon, and obviously Pro Tem Atkins. They made this happen. And I compliment and congratulate and thank them on behalf of everybody that was advantaged and benefited. Part of this was our paid sick leave, and now also moving $7.2 billion in tax relief and R&D tax credits. NOL is a fancy way, or just, it's not even fancy, it's just net operating loss. That's for your accountant to explain to you, but important. For a lot of businesses in the state, so reestablishing that, and it looks like we had a $5.5 million estimate in January. It looks to actually be even more generous contribution, 7.2. And then you see conformity, that's again, that conformity of the federal laws for restaurants and venues that were also looking for that conformity, small venues that were shuttered. They got that conformity in the early package. And then, of course, the additional $150 million in small business COVID relief grants. So I just put it in perspective. This is the big number I think is important. For small businesses, you add up what we did in the early action with what we're proposing and what we did. It's $4 billion and $150 million. And then, of course, well, I've now gone backwards in the slides, resources that include the additional $500 million. You're getting close to $5 billion is the long-winded point in grants to small businesses when you add those three up. I also want to remind folks just of some other things we did in January that may come up and certainly have come up in the legislature. We are having an interesting conversation about UI, talk about debt, unemployment insurance debt. It's real, direct impacts to payroll taxes for small businesses. We need to start paying that debt down. We need to start repaying the federal government. That's why we put $3 billion in the January budget. We also want to get tourists back in the state, build off that $95 million from the prior year, doing another $45 million we're proposing this year, waiving filing fees across the spectrum of supports, other tax credits. You see these slides in January, you saw them. I just want to remind folks the work we're doing in working with the legislature to advance those principles. We're also looking to do something to advance our values, not just our principles. And that's reflected in this graph, $2.1 billion in new grants, tax credits, and some augmentations, some reforms of sorts on our existing well-established California Competes tax credit program, which sunsets in a year. We want to extend it for 5 years, but we want to extend it, and by the way, expand it to include CHIPS, to get more money from the CHIPS Act. That's $120 million. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you wish. But we are looking to do it in a way that's reflective of our values. You know, I just, so interesting. There was, I think, 1 or 2 companies that left California and now are trying to fly their employees back to California to get support for their, California values make us competitive globally. It's the reason our economy's outperformed every other economy in the Western Hemisphere. 7.8% GDP growth, if you don't believe me, just last year. California, 7.8% GDP growth. The nation grew at 5.7%. Eat your heart out, Texas, 5.6%. California grew at 7.8% GDP growth. Interesting fact. Reflected, by the way, in these budget numbers, aren't they? So we want to be even more muscular. Let's grow. You want to relocate. You want to be where you value your employees, where your values that you express in your public documents are actually reflected in terms of the work we do as a state. We want to support you, and so we have $2.1 billion in relocation and opportunity credits that are reflected in this slide that we look forward to working with the legislature to fill in the blanks and some of the details and nuances that are still being worked out. Look, I talked about economic growth. We've never done that at the expense of a healthier California. And I think that's really important. It's not either or. We could talk about that in the context of COVID, but let's talk about it specifically in terms of health care. We are still on path to become the first state in U.S. history to provide universal health care, regardless of pre-existing condition, ability to pay, regardless of your immigration status, health for all. We're going to get it done this year. I want to thank Senator Durazo, so many others that have long-time champions for this. It's a big deal. I also recognize that COVID is not behind us, and this is a big deal to keep our mind focused and sharpened. As I was driving over here, turned off the TV, there was Dr. Fauci reminding us 4 days in a row with cases now over 100,000. Our positivity rate came in this morning at 4.4%. Interestingly, Florida was at 12.8%. Our case rate is about 152.8, which is a third of New York's case rate. And I say that not as compare and contrast from a competitive frame, but a compare and contrast of preview of things to come. We have to keep our mind focused. You've got the subvariant of the sublineage of the subvariant now. This B12 has got a B12 1.1, some derivation that only Dr. Galley understands. But will become, common knowledge in a few weeks or months. So we want to maintain that vigilance, and that's reflected in this May revise. And it's also reflected in the plan. We were the first state in America to put out a smarter plan, an actual plan. How do you live from a pandemic mindset or move into an endemic mindset? How do we live in the endemic realities where we can maintain our surveillance, maintain our capacity to move quickly and efficiently and effectively? And that's reflected in detail in the plan, and it's reflected in this budget as well that we are requesting of the legislature. I don't know that there's anything more personal for those with children, parents, or more universal in terms of unifying issue than addressing the issue of wellness, not just physical, but mental health. And I want to remind you, and I remind people all the time, I even remind some of my colleagues in the legislature, of what they did, what we are doing, what this state is doing. No other state in the country is doing this. We committed $4.5 billion on universal comprehensive service and screening for everybody 0 to 26 in the state of California. We did that last year, and has components that connect to the schools as well that are deeply connected to the strategy. We think we can do a little bit more, because as we fully implement, we're in the process of implementing that strategy. We want to do some things with more urgency and really focus on what's happening with technology, people's moods, stress, lack of sleep, feeling isolated, lonely, suicidation, broader issues. They're real, they're raw. There's not one of you that I imagine not quietly shaking their head. You get it. So we have to do more and better, and we have some proven strategies and solutions. We've put up some toolkits that don't exist anywhere else, some remarkable videos. Please take a look at these videos we put out. Dozens and dozens of culturally competent videos, instruction for parents, for teachers, for kids themselves. And we want to build on all that, and that's reflected in this additional $290 million we're requesting. Health, understandably, has expanded even deeper in one's consciousness as it relates to what's happened, what happened years ago at the Supreme Court, but what's now manifesting as a consequence of what happened over the last few years with the politicalization, from my humble perspective, ever since Mitch McConnell delayed that nomination and ultimately just exposed the harsh realities of hyper-partisan politics and tipped that third appointee in Donald Trump's hands in the court, and this is what we get. unenumerated rights going back to 1780. Is it interracial marriage next? Well, that's the senator from Indiana who says perhaps. Or is it gay marriage? Well, that's probably 2/3 of Republican senators. Or is it contraception? That may be what the Mississippi governor was unable to answer as it relates to IUDs, Plan B, and other contraceptives. That's the world we're living in. How can California future-proof itself? How can California do more for women and girls? Do more to advance our values? We put this out 2 days ago, building on what we did last year in terms of supporting reproductive health, addressing some gaps, addressing education opportunities. Again, we believe in equity, we believe in fairness, which means access and affordability, and that's advanced with incredible leadership. I mean, Speaker's office has been great, but perhaps no one better than our own pro tem leader of the Senate, who's also the principal advocate for a constitutional amendment codifying our reproductive rights and freedoms here in the state of California. And I just want to thank her and thank the entire leadership of the Assembly as well for their support in the past. And that includes, just as a quick reminder, on co-pays and deductibles and addressing issues of access at our universities, something that was stubborn. There were some efforts in the past that didn't get across the finish line. We were able to do that last year. And of course, addressing the issue of maternal and infant health. And I think that was part of the Momnibus, thank you, Senator Skinner, program, the Women's Caucus, across a spectrum of supports. There's not enough time and too many pages we'd have to burn through to go through the details of that remarkable plan. Though I do want to make a deep point here. California is a pro-life state. See, we believe that, well, let me back up. I think there's a lot of folks out there that are pro-conception to birth, but they fall wholly short of being pro-life. Because if you're pro-life, you'd support prenatal care, you'd support black infant health, you'd support child care and preschool. If you're pro-life, you'd believe in science, you'd believe in climate change. If you're pro-life, you would support home visiting. If you're pro-life, you'd actually support common sense gun safety. If you were pro-life, you would be expanding after-school and preschool programs. In every single one of these cases, universally, these same folks that claim or hold claim to this pro-life side are cutting those programs, opposing expansion of those programs in every single case. So spare me their mantra on being pro-life. They don't deserve that status. Not unless they are champions of things that are up on this board. We are, and I'm proud of that. I'm proud of this legislature. I'm proud to represent this state. The people of the state of California made this happen. Those are the things we're doing. That's a real pro-life agenda. It's a serious moment in American history. And I'm really proud of how serious this state and our legislative leaders take this moment and continue to build on so many of the programs that you see reflected here today. And please as well, if you're pro-life, how the hell is this possible? California has the lowest death rate per capita of all populous states in America. Just look at that. If we had Arizona's, just as an example, if we had Arizona's death rate in terms of the approach they took to saving lives on COVID, certainly Florida and Texas, just looking at the death rates in Arizona, we would have almost double the number of people that died because of COVID. Double. About 90,000 people tragically lost their lives in the state of California, 170,000, just shy of double. If you used the Arizona framework, would have died in the state of California. So forgive me again, spare me this notion of being pro-life as opposed to pro-birth. Proud of California. So healthier California is a safer California transition. And safety has to be broadly defined right now. I'm a parent. All of you are concerned about what's happened with opioid overdose deaths, concerned about what's happened with fentanyl in particular. I'm really proud of AG Bonta. He's particularly concerned about it, put together a proposal, $7.9 million proposal to create a new, task force doesn't do justice, but enforcement and strategy for vertical prosecution investigations to really get aggressive as it relates to what's happening with fentanyl. So we want to build that office. We want to create an opportunity to get the AG's office more directly and more deeply focused in this space. We also are looking, and I appreciate General Baldwin's here, I appreciate Mark Ghilarducci is here, Office of Emergency Service, of course, head of the National Guard. We have been quietly, because it hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but substantively working to combat cartel activity on the national border, or rather on the U.S. border in the state of California. We have a program that's been working. The interdiction has been working. We want to build on that, so we're looking to expand the work with the National Guard as it relates to what's happening on the border, particularly with increased activity. And we've seen this for years now. That's why we committed to that Border Patrol effort to address fentanyl coming through the border. Other public safety enhancements include $35 million in victim services, $50 million directly for officer wellness. Thank you to the men and women in uniform, many that are here today. We have to be mindful of what you've been through as well. And we want to invest in your wellness and your well-being. And we worked with the Police Chiefs Association, the sheriffs. They came up with some really interesting strategies, and we want to not just reward their thinking, but their service. And it's reflected in this wellness proposal. Sex trafficking, child sex trafficking. We have to do more in this space. Internet, across the spectrum, we're going to put more investment in that space. I'm so proud of our Secretary of Interior for highlighting the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous people. And that, if you haven't read that report, you should review that report of what's happened in this country, not unique to America, as we know. Canada just had a national reckoning in this space as well. We can do more and do better in this space. It's reflected here. And then thank you to the Jewish Caucus, Jesse Gabriel, everybody. Thank you for all the work you did helping support a new program a few years ago around security grants, broadening those investments, nonprofit security grants, an additional $50 million. We're putting in the May budget, and I know they'll be advocating for additional resources. Speaking of additional resources, in January, we put real emphasis on going after ghost guns, more buyback programs, gun buyback programs. Remarkable efforts that have been underway for years around retail theft, paying dividends. I saw a few weeks ago some prosecution specific to the efforts of the CHP task forces, where the Attorney General and other local law enforcement announced accountability and prosecution in this space. We're not being passive in this space. We're leaning in, and that included in that January budget the investigation and prosecution support and grants to local law enforcement agencies and support for small businesses that are victimized. And as a small business person myself, I understand the notion of I just understand the word deductible. Let's just leave it at that. And that's reflected in that last number. Homelessness, if it's not the number 1, 2, and 3 issue in the state, it's number 1, 2, 3, and 4 issue in our state, and it's certainly appropriately placed in terms of the prioritization of people in the state. $14.7 billion. I'll just remind you, look, 3.5 years ago, there was no plan for homelessness in the state of California. It was a $500 million appropriation. It wasn't attached to anything that the big 13 mayors requested. $500 million, just to cities and counties. Now we have a plan, we have strategies, we have partnerships, but now we want real accountability. You can see $14.7 billion. This is unprecedented. Trust me, finance, very cautious in this space, saying, why are we entering in this space? And it's obvious why, but this is not where the state of California has ever been. Maybe that explains a little bit of what we're all experiencing. So new resources we want to place, but with an emphasis on accountability, which you'll see reflected here in a moment. But specifically, we want some more immediate action, particularly on tiny homes, short-term strategies to address, rapid rehousing, deal with the crisis on the streets, not looking at 4 or 5 years to get something built or up and running. More immediate supports to help cities and counties, and that's reflected in $500 of the $700 million new requests. We want to expand Home Key. By the way, I don't know if you just saw, we crossed 10,000 new units under Home Key in less than 2 years. In less than 2 years. I appreciate those that are implementing the program. Want to acknowledge their own good work, and we acknowledge that amazing work. By the way, it was just, was, 7 new projects we just put out a couple days ago, $166 million, $1.1 billion just in the new program, 4,000 new units just since Home Key 2, 10,000 total, 10,000 in just less than a couple years. This has never been done, and we're winding up. So not only are we winding up, cities and counties, these incredible partners, doing the real work. It's the state vision's realized locally. They manage it. It's their responsibility locally, but we're funding it, a substantial part. We want to expand that. And of course, CareCore, which I'll talk about in a moment. I'll remind you of all the resources in January we put into behavioral health housing to rebuild behavioral health housing, and the work we want to do to focus, target our efforts on encampment cleanups. We did $50 million in encampment cleanup grants, first time in history. Last year, oversubscribed. We want to 10x them this year, and that's reflected in the January budget. We got to get that done. $12 billion, just remind you that 14.7, what it did, it was again creating Home Key 2.0. It was the behavioral health housing, $3+ billion, encampment resolution, which is again encampment cleanup grants. Room Key, we want to extend as we begin to phase out the federal program, want to provide resources for local government, and let me now emphasize local. Local government has received unprecedented supports with flexibility. $1 billion a year, they're getting another $1 billion in 22, 23. Understandably, they want more funding, they want more predictability. But understandably as well, you as taxpayers are waiting for their plans. In June, all the cities, counties, and what we refer to as CACs, which is a fancy way of saying regional agencies, will be putting forward something they were required because the legislature approved an effort to provide requirement for accountability plans from cities and counties to receive state money. 6 specific metrics, they have to be public. We measure them. If they're successful in their metrics, we actually have 18% bonuses. So we're incentivizing, not just being punitive if they don't put the plans out. The plans are supposed to come to us in June. It's a little of a chicken and egg right now. So before we put more money up, I want to see the plans. Let's see how they look. Let's see how the city and counties are working together or not, the regions working together or not. But we put language in the budget because we have built a great partnership with the big 13 mayors led this year by Libby Schaaf, last year by Sam Liccardo, who have been incredible partners. And we are committed to providing ongoing support, but we need to see more in terms of the accountability, which they support, and a little bit more focus in 3 key areas, and that's Home Key encampments, of which, again, they've been champions, and CareCourt, of which they also have been champions. On CareCourt, I want to remind people, and I just want to thank Senator Unberg, I want to thank Senator Eggman, I want to thank Assemblymember Dodd, I could go on, not Assemblymember Dodd, Senator Dodd, so many members of the legislature that have been out front and champions, including Assemblymember Bloom in particular, that have put themselves out on this. A lot of folks say, well, we just can't do it. I just want to remind folks, $11.6 billion per year is our existing funding in this space, just on the behavioral health side. It's up 70% since 2016. $3.7 billion this year, was $2.1 billion a few years ago, just in the Prop 63 money. All that realignment money, all the state grant money, all that money coming out of Medi-Cal. We're up 70%. We put $4.5 billion. I mentioned the $3 billion, and we put an additional $1.5 billion in that January budget specific to mental health beds. This is unprecedented support, not just one time, ongoing support. And so that's a big part of this story, but we also recognize we have to do more, and that's reflected in $64.7 million, 65 trued up for state and court support for a number of related programs. Look, let's just jump to the final issue and then see what's on folks' minds, talk about the issue that right now is connecting more issues than any other issue. And that's the issue of Mother Nature. I've said it a million times. She bats last. She bats 1,000. The vernacular baseball. She is, as I think Mr. Watson once said, chemistry, biology, and physics. That's all she is. And that's why we have to confront the extremes by confronting this challenge with an unprecedented budget. I should note the entire U.S. budget, which is the largest climate budget that we know of in the world, at the national level last year is $44 billion. That's just proposed in the Biden budget. Now, that's 1 year. This is 2 year. But it gives you a sense of the magnitude of what we're proposing. Additional $9.5 billion beyond what we put out in January. almost $50 billion in this space. Let's specifically talk about drought. And I know you may have some questions about some of the recent numbers, which are not shocking or surprising, and we could talk about proactively what we've been doing in that space. But we want to do more proactively to support our efforts on drought resilience and investments across the spectrum. $5.2 billion last year, not waiting to do a bond, using cash, moving projects. $750 in January. We want to do an additional $1.3 billion. But before that, I want to remind folks, we have a master plan for water. We put it out in July of 2020. It has 142 specific actions. And I want folks to know 127 are in progress, not all completed, in progress or have been completed. So we're working off this detailed strategy and plan with 142 specific action items around diversifying our water supplies, ecosystems, infrastructure, conveyance, and adapting to the new and challenging realities. But we're funding that plan in historic ways as well as the long point. And that $1.3 billion of additional resources we're requesting of the legislature beyond just what we provided in the January budget looks to address the immediacy around groundwater cleanup and water projects that are underway, and natural and working land solutions, issues around ag and conservation, and obviously direct relief, particularly to farmers, small farmers, and ag community. Look forward to working with the legislature on that package. Additionally, we recognize severity. Of course, just last few days down in Southern California, another reminder, we have sent, thank you to remarkable men and women that we sent out. I think we sent 5 engines, another 5 engines, 10 perhaps now total, PolitiFact me on that, to New Mexico recently because of their wildfires already this early in the season. Our mutual aid program, second to none. We're so blessed all across this country, and our Western state partners. We're all in this together. Just a reminder, we're all in this together across the Western United States. We are investing, when you look all in, $3.6 billion just in the last 2 years, additional $233 million specifically beyond the January budget, which we went through in detail. I'll go through just very quickly. But I want to do what I just did with water and remind you we have a master plan for wildfire and forest resilience. This was adopted in January of 2021. Rather than 142 actions, this has 99 key actions, 100. And you can see all are underway. 28 have been completed or are about to be completed. You can see the work we're doing in terms of prescribed burns, the work we're doing in partnership with the federal government. The Biden administration has been an incredible partner on our shared stewardship agreement and focusing on cutting green tape. Green tape, we're going to talk about that in energy in a second. That plan now, again, we're funding. That's what we bid in January: forest thinning, prescribed burns, reforestation, fuel breaks, new Office of Wildfire Technology. People are saying, we need new technology. Mark Killaducci says, no state has invested more in innovation and more different procurement strategies, including creating an Office of Wildfire Technology. In fact, people come from around the world to learn about our best practices, but we're humble, and we know we need to do more in terms of innovation and technology nonetheless. CAL FIRE, we put up, I'll remind you that January budget, $400 million to address supports in their workload, and all those investments in the helitankers and firehawks, contracting even more air resources, more fire crews, bulldozers, and the like. We now want to true that up even more. We want to add another 238 folks to the California Conservation Corps. We want 16 crews of our Fire ones. That's reflected in the $83 million for this fire season to augment. We've got non-firefighter support staff. That's the mission operations support. And then more staffing on the helitankers and more staffing on the firehawks as it relates to what we anticipate is going to be yet another challenging season. I referenced energy. Again, we're near the end. I want to focus on something that is going to be potentially an endless struggle. And that's realities of climate change that often are neglected, and that's energy reliability and affordability. You can see what drought has done in terms of reducing energy production. Let me give you a specific. You say, well, what does that mean? Well, just think of the Hyatt Dam, 925 megawatts up there at Lake Oroville, that went down last year for the first time in its half-century history. That impacted hydroelectric energy production. Extreme heat increases demand by definition. Everybody's turning on their air conditioning. And of course, wildfires decrease availability. And you say, well, what do you mean? Well, let's be specific. Just a year ago, you had that, I think it's bootleg fire up in Oregon, and we had 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts that were impacted, 4,000 overall. I think there's 3,000 in what we refer to as our ISO system alone that was impacted by that wildfire in Oregon. So all of those things create different stresses, climate-driven stresses. Now, we haven't been sitting by watching all of this. We've been leaning in unprecedented ways. Let me give you an example of the most significant. That's taking from 200 megawatts to 4,000 megawatts, just a battery storage. Just in the last, that's 2 years and 4 or 5 months that they have been able to procure 4,000 megawatts, or close to 4,000 megawatts. Yes, we had to delay some planned retirements, and we had to put some emergency generators up. We also need to be mindful we need to accelerate projects, particularly because we have been changing our modeling, and we are now recognizing some new factors and challenges, particularly as it relates to a new investigation by the Department of Commerce as it relates to tariffs that connect to some of our issues, geopolitical in China, but also other countries. That's impacting now the availability of solar into the U.S., notably here in California. The pandemic and induced related issues associated with supply chain have also changed some of the timelines in terms of our procurement, so much so that when you stack all these together and you reflect those extremes on wildfire and heat and drought, we're looking at potentially filling gaps that weren't there even a year or two ago. 7,300 megawatts this September, and as much as 10,400 megawatts in 2025. So how do we do that? We are requesting of the legislature, you'll see the number here in the next slide, but we are requesting creating a new strategic electricity reliability reserve. It's just a fancy way of saying putting together 5,000 megawatts that's available at a moment's notice. We also recognize, I mentioned green tape a moment ago, that we've got to streamline our entire permitting process. And we want to do it through the CEC, which is California Energy Commission, and create a one-stop process. And we want to drive these investments. California is as dumb, again, I used this phrase before, I'll use it again, we're dumb as we want to be. These large-scale projects and the rules and requirements that we created are now working against us to address the issue of why they were created in the first place. CEQA is now so damn abused that I remember being mayor trying to do a bike lane, and we were sued under CEQA from expanding bicycles. It's a serious thing. That's the world we created, at least Ronald Reagan created. It's just, we've got to disabuse ourselves that in the world it's radically changed with the extremes, that we can do business the way we did business. I mean, why do we have a housing crisis? Why am I putting this slide up? Why am I asking the legislature for a number that I hope opens some eyes, maybe even a mouth in a minute? We got to disabuse ourselves the way we've done things in the past. So streamlining is foundational, as well as moving to increase efficiency and more traditional demand response strategies. But here's the request. $8 billion of the surplus we're requesting of the legislature, building on the $2 billion we did for pumped storage and green hydrogen and other things in January, looking to do $8 billion. Let's see how that bears out. That 5,000 megawatts, $5 billion ask. We want to help people with what we refer to arrearages, which is a fancy word for people that have back bills and they're panicking because they can't afford them. $1.2 billion to address their utility stress and anxiety. And then these acceleration strategies around residential solar storage, all above solutions and strategies. So that's the idea, including this new electricity, final slide, transmission strategy in the Salton Sea. That's around geothermal in particular, but also around what I think makes California second to none, best in class. And that's our capacity to do things only nations dream of, that only California can do, and that's address broader supply chain issues. And we're working with the Biden administration. You may have witnessed or read about or may have missed some of the direct partnerships that we have announced with President Biden, who's actively taking a personal interest in lithium extraction in and around the Salton Sea. I want to thank Eddie Garcia and Senator Hueso, so many others. They've just been champions, but here's what makes them real champions. It's not just an economic opportunity to extract lithium in and around Imperial Valley and Salton Sea. It's the way we want to do it and the way they're demanding we do it, and that's with our values front and center. So we announced in January new strategies on lithium extraction. We talked about we did a lot of planning, a lot of work. Now we're making it real, and we've come up with a revenue share. 80% of any revenue that comes from this doesn't come to the state of California, comes directly to the locals, right back into the community, and the rest comes back specifically to Salton Sea restoration, ongoing support to deal with the 30,000+ acres that we've committed to restoring there. Streamlining as a process of engaging with more certainty the private sector so they'll make historic investments, sales tax exclusions on manufacturing equipment that bear fruit to this notion of partnership and support. And then we're dealing with workforce in a way I'm really excited about. Working with San Diego State University, their Brawley Center, they're looking to invest in a new center down there to create specific pathways for locals to get the jobs. I love this. So often the next big gold rush, and all that money becomes international, comes in the pockets of fancy folks, never goes back to the community. Everybody feels raw, and 60 Minutes comes out there 20 years later and does a report. We're trying to avoid all of that. We want to celebrate that, and that's because of the leadership of the senator and the mayor down there, so many other leaders, just been incredible, and Member Garcia. So thank you, all of them, and we just want folks to know that is a big part of our budget as well. So look, I know, you guys know me well enough to come to expect a little more enthusiasm from me, perhaps than others often when it comes to budgeting. But I'm really proud of where we are. I'm mindful of the vulnerabilities and the vagaries reflected geopolitically, reflected politically, period, not just globally, but the polarization that persists in this nation, impacts midterm elections may have in California in our future, impacts 2024 may have on our fate and future, impacts the Supreme Court, not just on reproductive rights, but on gun policy and privacy issues may have on our fate and future. And we're doing everything we can to future-proof California with our values front and center, values of inclusivity, regardless of your political stripes, regardless of your status. One state, one cause, one fight. And I want to again thank, in that spirit, the legislature. And if I haven't made that crystal clear, I want to reinforce it for yet another moment. None of this is possible without their partnership. And I've been blessed, it's just been a little over 3 years as governor, to have had a remarkably good working relationship with the legislature. We have differences, and that's wonderful. Thank God we do. And that's where we discover, through that dialectic, a sweet spot that we think reflects truly the diversity and values of our state even more substantively. And so I do look forward to working with the legislature on many of these issues, mindful that we will work together to augment, to consider, to reconsider things that were not included, things that should be, things that were included where they have perhaps a different point of view. And so, again, in that spirit, this budget will be submitted to them henceforth. We look forward to working with the LAO's office, as always, and we look forward to that direct engagement with many of the leaders over the course of the next few weeks. I will close by, before we open to questions, by just thanking Keely and her team. This is Keely's last budget. And I think it's her best budget that she has produced. So thank you, Keely, for all your hard work. Erica, Gail, the whole team, you guys are rock stars. We love you. Thank you for your service. And thank you for taking all the tough questions when I exit the stage as well. By the way, no, we did not exceed the GAN limit. We are $2.6 billion below the GAN limit. Any questions?
Hi there, Governor. Thank you for taking questions from the press corps today. Starting off, this is Colby Bermel at Politico. You, of course, are deeply familiar with the myriad climate crises facing our state, and I've got a few questions on that front tied to your May revise, of course. First off, just a big picture question to start. Even with the confluence of heat, drought, and wildfires, can you say today that the state will not experience rolling blackouts this summer like it did in August 2020?
Well, we're going to do everything we can to mitigate that. That's why we're not just planning, we're investing. We're not just identifying an issue, we're identifying specific, tangible actions to address that issue. We're being as transparent, perhaps, as any other state has ever been in this space in order to level set with folks, and we are making adjustments in real time. And so we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you. And just got two other quick policy questions tied to the May revise. That document includes $100 million for carbon removal, and as you probably know, CARB's draft scoping plan that came out this week included some provisions tied to technological CCS. And this has been criticized by environmental justice organizations because it supports enhanced oil recovery, it isn't necessarily cost-effective or even brings down emissions, and I just wanted to hear from you just a justification of the state's prioritization of CCS.
We all want to achieve the same goal. We may have different points of view in terms of pathways to achieve that goal. The reason it's included in the budget is we feel very strongly that it should be included in the budget. The reason it's being scoped by the California Air Resources Board is because they believe it should be scoped. We don't deal in ideology, we deal in reality. And the reality is we need to be more prepared, to be more resilient and more flexible and much more aggressive in capturing carbon and in our low-carbon green growth efforts, including radically, as we are, and you see that reflected in the larger $47.1 billion budget, radically changing the way we produce and consume energy at a stage and scale that's never been done in global history. And so I'm really proud of our environmental leaders and advisors that are fierce champions of environmental justice, also reflected in this budget in additional enhancements that were also not highlighted, including utilization of some of the February cap and trade proceeds. And I'm very grateful to the environmental justice leaders for their advocacy, but we believe we need to include it in the larger scoping strategies and considerations, and we look forward to that debate with the legislature.
And also wanted to ask about your May revise, which proposes $970 million for residential solar and storage incentives. I wanted to ask you if this is meant to make up essentially for the PUC's proposed decision on net metering that's been pretty widely criticized, and do you support the monthly fee on solar owners that's been called a solar tax?
Well, no one's making up for anything that didn't happen. There was no action by the CPUC. So no, it's consistent with investments we've made in the past. We're truing up investments at historic levels and scale. We look forward to socializing the more nuanced details of plan. As you heard from me in January, I felt that that proposal was inadequate, and I was pleased to see the CPUC acknowledge that, pull that proposal, and present a new proposal and plan, and we look forward to dialoguing across the spectrum. And without getting into the details, and I appreciate the final point in your question, we look forward to working with, as we have, advocates in this space and landing on an agreement where we can provide protection and support for an industry that is essential to our fate and future, and that's rooftop solar.
And just a very quick yes or no question, hopefully. You were just talking about the strategic electricity reliability reserve in the May revised $5.2 billion. Will those resources be online by this summer to help prevent blackouts? Well, yes or no?
With respect, I'm not going to play into binaries when it comes to the issue of climate and extremes, when it comes to the issue of procurement, tariffs, things in our control, things out of our control. That's one tool in the toolkit. There are many other strategies and approaches that are separate and above from that strategic investment of 5,000 megawatts. I would be cautious, but I understand why there's a focus on our hyper-transparency around the extreme of extremes that would lead to a shortfall this September, the extreme of extremes. In the worst case scenario, even by defining worst case scenarios in the past, stacking of worst case scenarios where we may have a shortfall, we're doing everything in our power to mitigate that, not waiting for new appropriations from the legislature. That is separate and above, is a long way of responding.
Governor, this is Adam Beam with the Associated Press. You're looking, of course, today at a $300 billion budget. I know the surplus is close to $100 billion when you include everything, not just discretionary. It's a remarkable number. Is that a sign to you that taxes are too high in California?
Well, it's a sign of how well a number of people are doing in this economy. It's a sign of what's happening in some respect across this nation and around the world. Concentration of wealth and success in the hands of a few that are enjoying abundance in historic and unprecedented ways. And I do not, and you've long heard me say this, I don't begrudge other people's success, quite the contrary. I am proud of California's progressive tax system. It's well established, it's foundational well before I got here, and we're the beneficiary of that. Now, as things change, we also share the burden in that respect, and that's why it's important to pay all these debts that we had paid off, important to pay down with cash some of these long-term obligations, as we're proposing to do, and of course stack more money in the rainy day reserve, operating reserves and contingency funds and the like. And so we're mindful. The voters approved in 2011 a new tax structure that expires, sunsets in a number of years. I do believe, long believed, that we should reform our entire tax system. There's not been a lot of momentum in that space. That's not something I'm walking away from because of the volatility, which remains a top concern for me, and again reflected in this budget. But I am proud of the fact that we will be distributing over $20 billion in tax rebates if our January and our now updated May proposal goes into effect over the course of just 2 calendar years.
Thank you. And Governor, yesterday, the Energy, or I think it was maybe the Coastal Commission, the one that you appoint several members to, voted down this large desalination plant in Southern California. And I wanted to ask, now that we're, of course, in the middle of this severe drought and water is, at a premium, at a shortage, is desalination not part of the state's strategy now going forward?
Well, we have 142 action items in our master plan for drought. 2 of them specifically lay claim to desalination being part of that strategy, 2 of the 142. So yes, it should be. Not just the desalination that was rejected by the Coastal Commission after being supported by many, many state agencies over the course of the last decade or so, but also brackish desal and other novel desalination strategies. So the answer is yes, it should be part, for no other reason than this: reliability, flexibility. This is a mega drought. Arguably, scientists argue that it's the most significant in 1,200 years of human history. It has impacted the entire west coast of the United States. We're finding bodies in Lake Mead. We lost hydroelectricity, Lake Oroville, first time in history since it was designed and inaugurated by then Governor Reagan. You've seen what's happened in the Colorado River. We need more tools. We need more flexibility. And so I've long supported that. They had a different point of view. We'll assess that. I'll learn more about it, their specific arguments today. But we believe that plan we put out well over 2 years ago, that includes 142 action items, that desalination being 2 of those 142 is appropriate.
Hi, Governor. This is Laura Cordy at Politico. Thanks, as always, for taking our questions. I want to ask more about gasoline cost relief, because you say you want to get this money out as quickly as possible, and you say you feel confident you can square the modest differences with legislative leaders. But we've known for some time now that these differences are, stalling things. And so my question to you is, if the goal is to get money to people as soon as possible, why double down on a proposal we already know the legislature isn't interested in passing?
Well, I reject the premise, and I don't mean that argumentatively. I mean that respectfully. The conversations I've directly had with leaders have gone this way. It really would help us to understand the magnitude of the surplus and the budget and the availability of resources after the May revise in order to then begin anew those direct conversations. That was perfectly understandable, and as a consequence, we've been all looking forward to this day where we present that budget. We put out a broader investment strategy, spending strategy, and then we work together to land in terms of where we think we'll be in terms of what's available. Then we work backwards. Our proposal, their proposal, is there's a few $1 billion of difference, but the fact is the spirit is completely consistent with the spirit we put out over 2 years ago with the Golden State stimulus. Their approach is to build off what we had originally proposed, and that's the distribution of funds through the FTB, which is the Franchise Tax Board. And by the way, forgive me, all of you, for going into the weeds here, but this is important so people understand what the actual difference is and what's not. I think people love differences, not what the actual differences are. The FTB, we thought was appropriate for the Golden State Stimulus 1 and 2. I noted, you may have heard it, I'll reinforce it, the money's still going out under FTB. A modest amount is remaining of the $9 billion that's been distributed so far to 12.9 million people, but it's still going out. So we said, in an effort, and by the way, we originally supported the FTB being the distribution mechanism. We went to the FTB as it relates to this relief, and we said, how do we speed it up this time? People need immediate relief. They said, well, you know what? This is actually probably the worst time for us. We said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, we have tax returns, and that has to be our priority. We said, well, you absolutely understand that. They said it actually would delay our ability to even go as fast as we did with the original Golden State stimulus. We said, well, that's unfortunate. We came back together as a team. I said, guys, we have to be creative here. What else can we do? It was offered a few days later. Well, there is the opportunity perhaps to go through the Department of Motor Vehicles and work through car registration. And they said, you know what? It has an advantage. I said, what's the advantage? They said, not only speed, we can get the checks distributed, but we actually can include people that were excluded through FTB, specifically SSDI recipients, seniors and disability, and those that don't pay any income taxes, and many undocumented residents. That seemed to me more appealing, not only covering more people, more vulnerable people, seniors that were excluded in particular, which was very difficult under the old proposal, and speed, all of the above. So we offered that proposal. That's the difference. If the legislature prefers a proposal that delays those payments, and I don't mean that pejoratively, but that extends those payments into next year because they prefer a more traditional path through the FTB, we'll work with them on that consideration. I've been crystal clear about that very publicly on multiple public occasions and privately. We're not wedded. We're not ideological. In fact, they built off our original proposal that we ultimately landed together on with the Golden State stimulus as the mechanism for distribution. The money was always something we knew we'd work together on. I'd like to be on the higher end. They have a different number, but perhaps their number will true up. We'll see, or we'll come down and meet together. I'd like to extend it to more people, and I'd like to get into the middle class a little bit. Middle class are feeling squeezed. I like to get folks earning $150,000, $200,000. Maybe even a little higher. And so that's our approach. As I say, I have confidence we'll land very, very quickly on an agreement.
Great. And I wanted to ask, I know you tried to, you don't want to talk about the GAN limit a whole lot, but I do want to ask about it because Senate leaders have said that they want to look at reforming the GAN limit. Is that something you would support, putting an amendment to voters in the next couple of years?
Well, not only would I support, I've been pretty proactive in my advocacy to reform not just GAN, but to reform our reserves, reform Prop 2. We need more reserves. We hit that statutory 10%. I noted that 476 million of that is bleeding over, what we referred to as a spillover, and Keely and her team could talk more in detail about the technical ways that's the case. We want to do more supplemental, but then we have GAN issues, and GAN then becomes a component of reforming Prop 2. So yes is the answer. I look forward to working with the legislature. I've had some wonderful conversations. Budget Chair Ting has been long a champion in the space. We had an opportunity to meet directly and discuss this, and other proposals are out there. We look forward to working together. We think this is long overdue, and it's a remarkably high-class problem, isn't it? Many of us never thought we'd ever experience this. And the vagaries and nuances, getting into the issues of subventions. If you really are paying attention, truly I've lost you on that. For local government, it's a lot of complexities, and trying to simplify it, and I think it's necessary. We've exposed the need to reform.
Governor, hi. Samantha Young with Kaiser Health News and California Healthline. Wanted to ask you about CalAIM. California is spending about $8 billion into CalAIM to transform Medi-Cal, and only a small percentage of the beneficiaries of Medi-Cal are going to really benefit from these new non-traditional services. And critics say that millions of Medi-Cal patients are suffering from inadequate health care and access today. So I want to ask you, why aren't you putting more focus and priority into fixing the Medi-Cal system that we have today for the 14 million existing Medi-Cal patients?
Well, I'm deeply honored to have had the privilege of working with Dr. Galley, who's been a champion of doing just that. And I would reject the critics that are not, I think, being fair to his work and his team's work in terms of doing just that, reforming the Medi-Cal system. And foundationally, it is around 1115 waivers, 1915 waivers, looking at whole person care statewide. It will begin with those 19 counties. The implementation, as you noted, is an $8 billion, but we did 1.2 last year, 2.8. We're requesting the legislature this year, and we're moving forward. It's the most exciting integration of brain and physical health and payment reform in a generation. That's foundational to reimagining the entire healthcare delivery system for those, as you suggest, 14 million Californians. We've expanded Medi-Cal. No other state in America has expanded. We just did it for those 50 and over just weeks ago, regardless of immigration status, and you saw in my budget, unprecedented U.S. history, expanding full-scope Medi-Cal for all undocumented residents in this state. We did more than any other state last year with doulas and other expansions, and we have a new Medi-Cal benefit that is something that often is forgotten. That's on mobile medical teams, $1.4 billion Medi-Cal expansion we're proud of as well. The outcomes, the efficacy, the transparency, all foundational in terms of the application that we finally got approved by the Biden administration, with more work still to be done to move those reforms forward. All of that with the backdrop of all of the headwinds of the pandemic. Boy, am I proud of that. I am proud of Dr. Galley, and he could talk more, and I'm happy. I know you could stay in communication, Kaiser News, with Dr. Galley and his team. He'll talk more about those reforms and talk more about how CalAIM looks to aggressively address those reforms in real time. So it's an and, not an or. Short-term investments, expansions, more accountability, more transparency, reforms that also I know many of you have highlighted in terms of contracting and putting out to contract old contracts that we haven't put out in some time. And I look forward to working with the legislature. Has been a great partner in this year to make this next big investment in our CalAIM strategy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I also saw in your May revise $100 million for the investment into biosimilar insulin. I know it's something you've talked about in the past, and I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit more detail. What is California looking for in a contractor, and what's the timeline to try and get an interchangeable insulin onto the market, and why do you think California can pull this off?
because California has market power. We can flex in ways no other state can. We've identified a partner. We're working with Senator Pan, who's a champion. He has a bill. We want to help fund and finance that strategy. There's two components of the $100 million, $50 million for the partnership that we'd want to form to bring down basically a cost insulin. A lot of folks have been talking about this forever. We'd be the first state to do it. CalRx, Spirit plan we initiated when I first got here to make this real. One of what we hope is many strategies in this space. Biosimilar insulin, bring down the costs from hundreds and hundreds of dollars to substantially more modest costs. I want to be mindful those dollar figures are still changing. We also, though, want to put 50 of that 100 into getting manufacturing, at least we're proposing, here in the state of California, which to me would be a very exciting opportunity. And so that's something we're presenting to the legislature for their consideration. And we look forward to working with Dr. Pan's office to further this effort and other members of the legislature, both legislatively and through the budget process to achieve this goal in relatively short order. To your question. Now, I can't give you the exact date because it's subject to the appropriation process, subject to the legislative process and the bells and whistles on the final legislative package, and subject to the partnership being more formalized, or specifically being formalized. But we are talking in relatively short period of time, not a decade, not 5 years, but within the next few calendar years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Governor. Nicole Nixon with Cap Radio. I want to follow up on something you said a few questions ago about wanting to look at reforming the entire state tax structure, and just wondering if you could give us a little more insight into your thinking there and what.
Well, I've you know me. I've been Bob Hertzberg and I have always been. We feel like we've been someone's basement talking about this for 10 years, and looking at services, looking at reforming the system. I've had some wonderful. Now she's going to be upset with me. Ana Montesantos and I and my team had some wonderful debates on this. I was out there as lieutenant governor, many different forums talking about this with Bob. He put out some proposals. They're not specific to my particular advocacy, but broad strokes and reforming. Again, just to address the smoothing, address the volatility. That's the spirit of them. Look at what we're taxing, look at what we're not. You see a lot of conservative states that are taxing services that California doesn't tax. We tax goods at a much higher rate. Obviously, the volatility with 1% of taxpayers generating 49%. Those are 2020 numbers. Looking for updated numbers, 49% of all that revenue you saw on that screen. So the volatility is real. Capital gains, interest rate being cut, hiked, S&P, NASDAQ, probably more drive what happens on these budget presentations than anything, perhaps too much. And so that's the idea of smoothing, looking at reforms across the spectrum. We have nothing specific. Just being transparent about a point of view that I've had for years. We started here in 2019. I had some, what I felt were advanced conversations with the legislature in this space, and then the pandemic hit. And we focused on a number of other issues. There didn't seem to be a lot of appetite. There'll be a new legislature, new members next year, and I look forward to re-engaging on this topic.
Your office mentioned earlier this week that you'd propose incentives for businesses to relocate from other states, particularly, states that are imposing anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ legislation. Do you have any more details on that? Yeah,
you may have seen a slide that I put up that laid out the three specific tax areas for consideration. Let me pull it up for you here in a moment. So you can see from this slide that we just pulled up, $2.1 billion specifically that we are proposing in 3 categories. This clean energy grants over a 4-year period, 5-year period, as we look to extend the California Competes tax credit and make some augmentation. And obviously the exemptions that we already provide. I think it's about $100 million, extending those exemptions, additional $15 million a year for 3 years. On sales tax related to manufacturing equipment. You'll see, though, on the bottom, perhaps the lead line, which is updating existing incentive programs and looking at new incentive programs to align more with our values and to see if we can induce a recognition and a bit of a reconciliation for the values that a lot of companies profess but aren't practiced in the state they're doing business in. if you profess certain values that are very consistent across the spectrum of private companies that express themselves in terms of values of diversity and inclusion, California is the place to do business, period, full stop. We don't think there's any other better place. We're hoping to induce a renewed consideration of that, and that's reflected in this proposal. That said, we're working with the legislature, and we're looking forward, Gail, my team, she's leading this, to tweak this proposal and fill in all the blanks, answer the good questions, tough questions that the legislature will ask in the next few weeks, and talk more about it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Governor Newsom. This is Lindsay Holden from the Sacramento Bee. I wanted to follow up a bit on what Laura was mentioning regarding the tax refund. I understand not going the FTB route to get people money quicker, to reach different people than you reached with the Golden State stimulus. However, this plan would give potentially $800 to a well-off family with 2 vehicles, while a low-income family without vehicles is still struggling to pay for groceries. Can you explain how you might address that discrepancy?
Well, we've also been clear, and I think you've reported on it, and I appreciate the reporting, that we made it crystal clear after the proposal, which was made here in this place where we are in a few months ago, that we believe we should cap those contributions. So we would look to come with a means cap, and working with the DMV, we made it clear we're working with the DMV to figure out exactly where that would land. Now, as it relates to the broader question of who's included and who's not, you put up in the frame of your question, you painted rather a picture that we acknowledge needed to be painted, and it's actually an attribute of our proposal that's not in the legislative proposal, and that's the free transit for people that don't even own cars. That is also a component of our proposal, $750 million to be exact, including active transportation improvements, and of course the support to address the stress related to diesel tax increases. Again, those are additional attributes supporting those that are not included in the other proposal. These are, again, easily addressed. We'll work with the legislature. I don't see a lot of daylight between these proposals. It's just a question of the how we want to proceed, what figure, what dollar figure. We worked collaboratively together to come up with the Golden State Stimulus 1 and 2, worked to $600 to $2,200. We capped that at the time at $75,000. A lot of folks feeling like, wait, I earn $80,000, barely making ends meet, can't even find, let alone afford, baby formula. What about me? Then we met, a lot of seniors were lighting up. I think they all got my cell phone. Why weren't we included? I was sensitive to that. They were right. So we're just trying to balance those things. So we have some things the legislature doesn't. They have an approach that we don't. And I'm confident we'll find common ground.
Okay, I also had a question about care courts. In the revise, it looked like there was funding set aside to implement the care court plan, but there are concerns from people that the plan doesn't include housing for those who would be part of the program. Is there a plan to use some of the funding for the behavioral health funding, the mental health bed funding you mentioned? Will that be used to provide housing, or how will you all address that?
There's unprecedented investments in housing. Unprecedented, specific to board and care, to transitional housing, housing specifically set aside for mentally ill, 33,000 units to be exact. So that's the answer to the question, clear and concise.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Governor. Laura Mahoney with Bloomberg. I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about your cannabis tax proposal. It looks like you're proposing to eliminate the cultivation tax, keep the excise tax, but change the collection point, and then cap some general fund or cap spending for specific programs from that revenue and backfill with some general fund if needed.
Well, I think you've just described the program.
Can you, I read fast, I guess. Can you talk a little bit about your thinking behind your proposal and also the status of negotiations with lawmakers on this?
Yeah.
And also criticism from the people who get the funding about worrying that they're not going to get the money that they were promised.
Well, I'm very proud of the team that's leading this effort, Cole Elliott and others that have I've been long trying to champion these reforms, working with many members of the legislature, Senator Bradford included, and equity components of this, working with local governments to address some of the vagaries as it relates to the lack of support that still exists with municipalities that are not affording retail operations or distribution or delivery issues that have presented themselves. So we're looking to provide additional grants beyond what you've just laid out to local governments. You can see on a slide here, $21 million specifically to expand retail operations and to address some of those issues, all with an eye in terms of answering your question about the thinking of addressing the persistent issue that is exactly what we anticipated would be a persistent issue. And that's dealing with the black market, going after the illegal growers, illegal operators, trying to level set, trying to be flexible in terms of the cost pressures related to current tax structure and the lack thereof in the black market. And so that's where we've gone, working very closely with legislative leaders, and we've made tremendous progress. Now, that said, we haven't finalized any of that, so I want to be careful not to disrupt that progress, but we're seeing a lot of progress in this space and a lot of improvements, including a reflection of that progress, an acknowledgement that if you do lower that cultivation tax in particular, that there may be a temporary reduction in taxes, and we want to provide backfill for the three key areas that are the beneficiaries, three key categories of beneficiaries, as it relates to children, youth, and family, as it relates to environment, and it relates to law enforcement, to backfill their reduction of tax revenue that may occur as well. And that's reflected in that $150 million that we're proposing to put in the budget in that space. So all of this is constant and never-ending in terms of need to move, to understand, provide flexibility to meet changing criteria and conditions, address the intended, unintended consequences. So this is the beginning of a process from my humble perspective in terms of my thinking. This will be a multi-year process to get that black market, get it on the retreat, not the ascendancy, and to get the retail and responsible adult use market in steady ground.
Thanks. And more broadly, can you talk about whether you're worried about your budget proposals adding to issues like inflation if the state begins flooding its money into the economy with tax cuts, grants, all these other spending proposals that you've got going on to spend this giant surplus?
Investing and putting money in people's pockets to absorb the spikes and increase in costs of eggs, milk, bread, gas, childcare is something that should be an imperative for every elected official across this country. Providing rebates to taxpayers, I think, is wise and noble, and something that I think should be celebrated, not criticized. So no, offsetting the cost burden in this state to millions of working families, I think, is wise because of those inflationary burdens. And no, I do not believe in the macro it will have a significant impact. That said, I want to note two things. We, in February, estimated our inflationary rate to be a little more modest than the national inflationary rate, around 7.2% in our February analysis, 4.3% it averaged the prior year. We are doing a true-up in terms of our own budgeting to reflect an increase in inflation, reflecting where we were in January in our thinking versus where we are in May, to look to be a little bit more conservative in the out years in terms of investments. Inflation, it's a long way of saying this, nonetheless is deeply impacting our thinking in other ways in terms of our multi-year approach to budgeting, in terms of our medium and long-term investments, but does not impact, to your question, our short-term thinking of providing immediate relief, putting money in pockets of working families.
Thank you.
Hi, Governor. Sophia Bolag from the San Francisco Chronicle. You criticized CEQA earlier, and
I didn't even know you went to the Chronicle, so I'm sorry.
You criticized CEQA earlier, and I'm wondering what specifically you would like to see changed about that law and whether you're working with lawmakers to change it.
Well, I criticized, not CEQA, I criticized the abuse of CEQA. And I highlighted and referenced a San Francisco example when I was, I think, I may have just become mayor. I was a county supervisor for clarification. It was around that time where a young man sued us to stop, again, our completion of our bike lane network, which I found rather perverse. He ultimately lost, but he delayed the implementation. And I remember it very closely because San Francisco was a leader nationally in terms of its environmental work, but we always were the second-ranked city to Portland, Oregon, because they had the bike network, and that was what was missing. So I remember it from a very competitive frame, but I lamented it. I've been on the receiving end of CEQA abuse in my private life. I've seen that abuse over and over and over again in my professional life. All of us have. That's why I've signed 17 CEQA bills since I've been governor. So that's reflected, those reforms, in a response to your question of what I've sought to see reformed. As it relates to subsequent reforms, I know there are a number of proposals out there in the legislature. I know a lot of people have ideas in terms of reform, and I look forward to working with legislative leaders and advocates. This is not to gut that process, quite the contrary. It's quite more certainty, more predictability, so we can address the systemic issues in this state, like housing and affordability, and the looming potential crises of not meeting our goals as it relates to extreme weather across a spectrum, from drought preparedness to wildfire preparedness, where CEQA is abused as well in terms of our forest management work, to issues, of course, related to energy.
I also wanted to ask you about the healthcare parts of this proposal. You noted that this revised May proposal takes some steps toward universal healthcare coverage by expanding eligibility to more undocumented people, adding subsidies for middle-income people. But this still doesn't put forward a plan to move California toward a single-payer system, which is something you've talked a lot about supporting. And so I'm wondering why that is and why you aren't doing more right now to move California toward a single-payer system.
I'll refer you to the January questions that you and others had on this topic to update a frame of consciousness of the actions we have taken. And I'd also refer to you, I don't know the exact page, usually do, in the budget, with the specific actions we just took to advance that effort. As you know, a number of years ago, working with the legislature, there was establishment of a Healthy California for All Commission. That commission is a diverse commission. They were tasked with millions of dollars in resources to put out a plan, number of plans, on the how, the application of an ideal. What are the next steps? What's needed? What are the current attributes in California? What are the liabilities? What is needed from the federal government? What's needed across the spectrum of issues, ERISA issues, not just issues related to the exchange, Medicare issues around Medicaid and the like. Is the preferred model a Bismarck model, Otto Bismarck's infamous model, or is it a Beveridge model, or is it the national health insurance model? The point was, I'm emphasizing, to deeply analyze the how. That commission just approved, I think, Dr. Galley, an 11-to-1 vote, if I'm wrong, a report that was just submitted to the legislature. I look forward to the legislature's comments about the report, but we recognized, having read and reviewed a draft, that there were things we can do immediately. In January, and we reminded you of this in January, I'll remind you the May revise, recognized one of the critical issues is around data transparency and around issues of workforce, included real investments in that space. But in May, the budget we just proposed, we also recognized we need to be more aggressive in our advocacy. We're struggling with the Biden administration to get waivers, and I've not been shy about those waivers. I've requested them in the Trump administration and requested them in the Biden administration, that we need to be more aggressive, and we want a full-time team. And in this budget is staffing of a full-time team at HHS to pursue those waivers, to pursue a deeper understanding locally and regionally, and with our private sector partners of what this means and what this doesn't, so that we can continue to move the ball forward. So that's included in this May revise. The steps we have taken are more progressive than any state in the United States of America, but I am not going to apologize for being the first state in U.S. history to provide universal health care for everyone in the interim. In fact, I'm going to celebrate that when I have the privilege of signing that trailer bill, and I look forward to being there with Senator Razzo and others that probably couldn't have imagined that happening in 2022. And so progress we are making, but it's parallel as it relates to the larger issue around single-payer financing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Governor. This is Daniela Pardo with Spectrum News. On the topic of Medi-Cal, when will the expansion be to include adults 50 and under?
The expansion for 50 and over was just put into place. The current proposal in the revise, and Keely can correct me, is January 2024, the phased-in implementation. At full implementation, correct me, a lot of numbers, $2.2 billion annualized cost of general fund, but the implementation date being July, or rather January, I believe, of 2024.
And then as far as the $400 checks, I know that you said that's the best way to provide relief for Californians affected by the high cost of gas. Have you ruled out suspending the gas tax, or is that something you're still considering?
Well, I think there's a better approach. Providing no guarantee to the consumer that that gas tax suspension of 51 cents, 51.1 cents, would be passed on, I think would be foolhardy. Why would we suspend a gas tax and allow these same corporate interests and companies to pocket those dollars by not passing them on to consumers, when there's a better approach, which is putting money in people's pockets more quickly, a full amount of money, than the money that they would enjoy over a period of time of filling up their tank over a year. We think that's a better approach. And so that's why I'm not interested in the political platitudes of well-rehearsed lines from the other side on this, and more interested in doing something that will provide real relief. Now, some say that relief, you can call it gas. We said to address the issue of gas, but others say it should be just inflation relief across the spectrum. Inflation defined in energy, food, and the like. It's a nomenclature, but relief nonetheless. And we're hoping that over a 2-year period, that relief will be in excess of $20 billion. This is the biggest relief package in U.S. history, as I noted. And I just want to get that money out as quickly and as efficiently and effectively as possible. And we look forward to working with the legislature in terms of adapting a strategy to do just that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Taryn Luna with the Los Angeles Times. Governor, you talked about getting refunds out quickly to Californians, but so far nothing about this has happened quickly. You introduced the idea in March, and you wanted to reach an agreement before today. We're here today with no agreement, and you had hoped to get refunds out starting in July. And now if you pass this with the rest of the budget, refunds likely wouldn't go out until September. So what do you say to Californians who are struggling right now and can't understand why this hasn't happened as quickly as you wanted it to and as they need it to?
Well, I'd say how proud I am that 12.9 million of them have been on a daily basis receiving up to $9 billion of direct rebates. This is not the only game in town. We've been doing things across the spectrum of supports. That's what I would tell the people of the state of California. Money is still going out as we speak, as much as $2,200 per person. I'd also let the folks know, the state of California, that there is some practical realities that we've been very crystal clear about. No, nothing surprising. Said it prior questions. I said it in a half dozen press conferences, that the legislature and in private with the legislative leaders, we're looking forward to where the May revise landed so they'll understand exactly what's the available pool of money. So it's perfectly understandable that the legislature wanted to wait to see where we were today in order to make a commitment moving forward. You need to see the entire picture. And because of the fluidity, and you've seen that in ways, frankly, even 3 months ago, we could not have anticipated, around the volatility of the markets, the volatility of our tax receipts, the big three, sales, PIT, and obviously corporate tax exceeding expectation, even the most ambitious thinking, it was exceeded. that there's probably wisdom in their point of view and approach. And now we can approach this issue with an understanding that we didn't have prior. That's what I would tell the people of the state. And with the seriousness of purpose that the people deserve, in order to make sure as we phase out the first phase of unprecedented tax rebates, largest in U.S. history, that we begin now to phase in an even larger tax rebate, again, the largest in U.S. history.
On the issue of the hero pay, why will grocery workers and others who risk their lives throughout the pandemic without the same access to PPE not receive the same state bonuses as hospital and nursing home workers?
Well, that question assumes that the budget's been approved and signed. That question assumes that we haven't gone through the process of engaging the legislature that may want to address that issue directly and work with us to prioritize that over other priorities in this budget. I don't assume anything. I do, though, assume that the $933 million 1,500 retention bonus for some nursing home and hospitals will be well received. I do assume that the support for others that is included in this budget will be well received, but I also assume that the legislature may want to provide a different blueprint. They may have some thoughts, and I'm looking forward to their points of view, as I do every year throughout this budget process.
It was only assumed because your budget and your revise gives this money to healthcare workers and nursing home workers and not grocery workers. So is there any reason why maybe you didn't prioritize grocery store workers or others who didn't have access to PPE and who worked throughout the pandemic in the same way in your revised budget?
I think you can ask my friends at UFCW, the few champions for grocery workers that I'd take a back seat to. I'm really proud of the work we did throughout the pandemic, and I've honored them and celebrated them. The challenge with any budget is you have to do a lot of things, and a lot of folks want you to do even more. And that's the nature of proposals and budgets. What's wonderful about a budget, and I've done many of these, is the engagement with the legislature. And I look forward to engaging them and addressing their perspectives and points of view. And I think what matters is where we end up. So we did a lot. I think as my mom said, you can do anything, but you can't do everything. And perhaps that's the best way to answer your question.
Thanks.
Hi, Governor. You're almost at the finish line. I am the second to last reporter, Ashley Zavala with Nexstar Media Group. Forgive me if this question seems repetitive with your answers already to tax reform questions.
Well, you don't have to ask it then.
Okay, I have to anyway. The Legislative Analyst Office, I know you said that right now we're under GAN, under this current proposal.
Correct.
They've raised concerns that over time, there could be implications with the state appropriations limit, and they, over time, in the long term, have presented two options, one of which you've said you've supported today, which is asking voters to change the limit. The other option is reducing taxes over time, and I'm wondering if that's a non-starter for you and where you stand on that.
Again, I think my position on reforming our tax system has been well established for well over a decade, my time as lieutenant governor, and certainly reflected today in comments I've made. As it relates to the LAO, they're right, we need to reform the GAN. We need to reform GAN, and I, again, think it's foundational that we reform our Prop 2, our reserve system, and I think they're all connected. And I just look forward to working with the legislature, get something on the ballot, and put that forward.
Okay, now I have a totally off-topic question. An effort to establish a 32-hour work week in the legislature is stalling, and I'm wondering, we haven't talked much about this year, but where you stand on that kind of structure for California workers?
I don't think it's a bad thing that it's stalling.
Thank you.
Hi, Governor. Thanks for taking my questions. I'm Dave Manicherry with KCRA. My first question is, you brought it up in January and you brought it up again today, the money that you've earmarked to pay down some of the UI fund. That's some, but it's not much in comparison to the UI fund itself that's in the hole. So Are there other things that you hope will help these businesses that were also impacted by the pandemic and the shutdowns and all those other things, whose tax bills are going to come quicker than they expect at a certain point?
Well, I'll remind you all the things we are doing for those businesses. And I'll remind you not just what we are doing, what we've done. Billions and billions of dollars of grants, fees, fines, waivers, exclusions. Specifically, just example, just all the businesses with alcohol beverage licenses that didn't pay any fees, all the direct grants, billions and billions of dollars of direct grants, tax cuts, unprecedented amount of tax cuts in terms of the early action that we took with the legislature, adding more categories. There's 10 categories now in our grants specifically for venues that were impacted and shuttered. The $3 billion, not the first time I offered the legislature the ability in terms of just our priority on UI to pay down. Last year they redirected some of that money, you may recall. I'm coming at it again to put more money in that space because we have to own up to that unfunded, that commitment that we will have to fund into the future. Otherwise, again, it will impact payroll taxes. So the answer to your question is yes, very specifically. We put forward many, many proposals. And for the purpose of just further illuminating, gives me an opportunity to go back to that slide of not only specific actions that we want to take in May, but specific actions we took last year, including those early budget actions. So back to the May investments, as you can see here. Additional grants, and I'll remind you that $500 million, we did $150 million early action in January, and that's on top of the $4 billion that we had already done in grants last year. So that's $4.65 billion. The conformity expansion is a tax cut. It was $6.2 billion last year. You're seeing another $450 million specifically to many of those same businesses. Again, to the extent there's an overlay with businesses with delivery, a lot of sole proprietorships, the diesel pause, and supports that we've expanded to businesses, many that are impacted specific in this region indirectly, expanding access to capital, not loans, but specific grants that are related to the drought. The early budget actions totaled $7.2 billion, you see, with the tax relief and the net operating loss. Conformity, again, was expanded to venues that were shuttered that were not part of the original conformity. And of course, the money that we put on waiving fees, technical assistance, all of these other spectrum. By the way, there's about 2 more pages of this. I'll get you the entire list. It's an amazing list. Really is. Really proud of it. All go deep to your question and an appropriate response.
I noticed that you have $136 million in funding for EDD, for the EDD Next project, and it's a 5-year plan to sort of modernize. This is a department that has been told that it needs to modernize for years now. Do you have benchmarks that you want them to meet? What kind of oversight are you going to have in place to make sure that they meet these benchmarks and actually do that modernization that they haven't done for over a decade now?
Yeah, I can't make up for what wasn't done before I got here. And boy, we were flying a plane and trying to patch together and hold it together during this pandemic. By the way, not unique to in any way, shape, or form to the state of California. I talked to every governor in this country who's expressed similar frustrations with their systems that were overwhelmed, particularly with the PUA program, which was a brand new novel program. And I'm really proud of California. We engaged with the federal government, working very closely with the Biden administration on highlighting and illuminating a lot of those issues and vulnerabilities. And we put together not just a strike team task force, but we have a whole new team at EDD, which you're familiar with as well. We have also not been shy about going after all the abuses in terms of the criminal investigations. We put together a team that has already investigated just the state. And by the way, we have partners working on investigations within the state that are not included, 1,500 criminal investigations. We've seen convictions and arrests in terms of fraud, all of it around rebuilding the system. We hired former special counsel for the Trump administration, Special Counsel McGregor Scott, to lead these efforts, and he's done a magnificent job. I really want to compliment his team. You're correct. We have budgeted more money January and more in May on upgrading and implementing reforms at EDD, continuing to build on those reforms, including reimagining it completely. And I appreciate and I do appreciate your familiarity with EDD Next, which is about that reimagining and revisioning our entire process, not just from an IT perspective, but business process improvements that are required. And the oversight, the new team, the focus on leaving whoever comes after me a better system than the one I received, I assure you is top of mind, not just topical, and something that I'm looking forward to working with the legislature to continue to advance.
And this will be my last question, Governor, but you also have some money earmarked for combating that fraud, $20 billion and counting. It's one of those things. I know that there are units inside EDD, but the new unit that the auditor had recommended is 12 people for the 44 million in the state of California. Most of these investigations are being done by local PDs and DAs. I know some of that money is earmarked for them, but how much do you think is going to go to these units that are spending 80-90% of their day investigating EDD fraud when they could be investigating other things?
No better person. Why ask me? I can give you a response, but better to have the person they hired full-time to focus on this, working with our federal, state, and local partners, and that's McGregor Scott, who's, as I said, put together a remarkable group of people, a team, task force, working with Mark Ghilarducci, sheriffs, working with district attorneys. We're funding a lot of those investigations, but I think notably working with the federal government, and that's where we are making tremendous progress as well. We put a lot of new technology, the ID.me system. We're one of the first, not the first, but one of the first states to implement that new strategy. Thomson Reuters, others, working with the federal government, actually helped the Biden administration put together a task force in this space, highlighted this with other state governors. We've been probably the most transparent state in the country around this. That's why those numbers are very public, have been for years now. We've not been shy around this in terms of being very forthright about what's going on. So I'm really pleased with their progress, and this budget reflects their asks in terms of next steps, and to the extent that we feel there's still gaps, or the legislature does, I look forward to closing those gaps before we close this budget.
Do you have any concerns, though, that money, the fraudulent money under pandemic unemployment assistance, is going to have to get paid back to the federal government at a certain point? It'll come out of the state's coffers?
Well, we'll pay our obligations. It's not unique to California. This is a burden reality for other states. The numbers are so much bigger in California. I think the last time I looked, we were about $180.3 billion, I think that Q1, in just unemployment claims that were administered. So it's a rather extraordinary number. And so it makes California's numbers seem that much larger. But no, we collectively, I know we've had a lot of calls to the National Governors Association. That's why I'm smiling. It's a big issue for governors and advocacy in Congress to address this issue all of us are facing.
All right. Thanks, Governor.
Yeah, thanks.
That is all the questions, sir.
Well, with that, let me thank you all. Hopefully we get you before lunch. And then now I have the great pleasure to give you who you've been waiting for, and that's the finance team, to walk through all of the nuances and details around subventions and capital questions related to the GAN limit. Thank you all very, very much for your time today.
Thank you. It is a bit bittersweet that this is my last budget press conference after nearly 9 years attending them at either finance or the governor's office under two governors. It's been an honor and a privilege to do this work, and it's been a special privilege to lead the department over the last 2 years. Our mettle was tested, but I'm incredibly proud of the determination and resilience of the professionals at the Department of Finance. Thank you for all you do. And a special thanks to my exec team, Erica, Gail, Richard, Carrie, Jolie, and HD. I could not have done this without each and every one of you, especially all the in-between moments of laughter and smiles and support. I also want to extend special thanks and appreciation to the governor, who did a great job today, for extending me the opportunity to serve as his first finance director. And I also wanted to thank Jim DeBoo, our chief of staff, for his support and confidence. And I would be remiss if I didn't give a special thanks to Ana Montesantos, who came before me as a director for 2 other governors. And we make a great team, and the partnership has been a constant, and for that, I'm very grateful. And then finally, I just want to thank my husband and my 2 daughters who have shown incredible patience and love and unwavering support through it all. So with that, I will get to the numbers, but I just wanted to go over some of the top-line surplus numbers because there are some different definitions that we've used and the LAO has used. The governor put the big number out there. It's $97.5 billion. That's up $54.9 billion since January. That includes several components. One of them that's in the introduction chapter is the non-98 discretionary surplus, and that is $49.2 billion. Up $31.7 billion since May. A few other components that are included in the 97.5 are the constitutionally required Prop 2 debt payments, that's $3.4 billion. The reserve deposits, which are an additional $7.2 billion, that's to our rainy day fund only. And then Prop 98, which is $35.7 billion, and that's up $21.1 billion since January. So I wanted to go over that. Just a few other points about resiliency. We certainly have the reserves that are at all in $37.1 billion. The governor went through that pretty clearly. We're also paying down debts. That's switching lease revenue bonds to cash financing and also calling some of our GO bond debt early. And that's $6.2 billion. Again, we're continuing to pay down pension liabilities through that Prop 2 debt payment. We've got $3.4 billion in the budget this year. And then the big piece that I want to emphasize about how we've built resiliency into this budget is really focusing on one-time expenditures versus ongoing. And we have a lot of one-time expenditures, not just in the budget year, but in the multi-year. And while that is our plan, if plans change, we will be able to make adjustments more easily than when we commit to ongoing expenditures. And then finally, I just wanted to note that we are cognizant that all of the inflation that we're seeing in the numbers have not been properly reflected in our budget estimates. And so we are making a below-the-line adjustment to account for that increased inflationary costs that we do think are going to show up in future budgets and are just delayed in the reflection in the current estimate. So all of those things, I think, are really important to building resiliency. I wanted to hit a couple follow-ups from the governor's question and answer on CalAIM and procurement. I just want to emphasize how broad-based the CalAIM program is. We really talk a lot about a small portion of it, which is the emphasis on social determinants of health. Certainly a lot of changes that will really aid individuals with a lot of complex needs, often including homelessness. But that's not all there is to CalAIM. And the CalAIM is a broad-based delivery system reform, program and payment reform at its base, and along with reprocurement efforts that are going on, are going to be significant changes to the way that program operates. Minimum wage and the impact on inflation, I just wanted to follow up on that because we have some specific numbers about that. We just a little bit about, obviously the minimum wage has been going up for several years now since the law was enacted in 2016. This minimum wage increase, we estimate, is going to account for about $3 billion in the state's personal income. The state's personal income, for context, is $3.3 trillion. So it's a pretty small percentage, a very small percentage, 0.1% of the state's personal income. So while it's very meaningful to those families that are working at and around minimum wage, we do not see that that's going to be exacerbating inflation directly given the scale. The governor was absolutely correct. He had the $2.2 billion general fund number, which is the full implementation from January for healthcare for all. Implementation date January 1, 2024. That was the January number. We have done a slight revision, so the current estimate, because we update our caseload numbers every process, and we have a slight decline. We think it's about 2.1 billion general fund at full implementation. So that is another important point. The other thing I wanted to focus on about why hospitals and nursing homes, there was a lot of questions about that. Across the nation, we're seeing major retention issues in our hospitals and nursing homes with staff. We've contributed hundreds of millions of dollars towards providing surge staffing during the COVID, the worst parts of the COVID pandemic. Just to make sure that we have enough staff to staff these important facilities. And so that is one of the big reasons why hospitals and nursing home staff are called out. We call these retention payments because it's exactly that. We want folks to stay in their current line of work, and we want them to continue to thrive there. And times will be better ahead. So with that, I'll answer any questions.
This is Adam Beam with the AP. Congrats on your career at the Department of Finance. We'll miss asking you all these questions about subventions and everything else. I wanted to ask about capital gains. I saw in the document that capital gains makes up, I think, about 9.7% of personal income, was near the all-time high. And you have that. You project that that's going to decline to about 5%, I think, by 2026. Is that going to pose a problem for the budget, or I know it's a big part of the revenues.
Right. So, I think that's really one of the things that we look at the capital gains numbers, how high they're going up, especially the governor pointed out as a percent of the state's personal income, how they are approaching the same levels right before the dot-com bust. So we're just very cognizant, and we've really revised our capital gains numbers down for the multi-year just because there's so much uncertainty about what will continue. So at this point, our multi-year is balanced across the board based on those revised revenue estimates that do bring down that capital gains assumption significantly in the out years. Of course, as the LAO pointed out very clearly, the state appropriations limit we are very near it. And in future years, even if there's additional growth above what we're estimating, it's possible that there will be additional constitutional obligations under SAL that are triggered. That would require reorganizing the budget plan to accommodate those constitutionally driven expenditures. So it's a bit of a tight walk or a tightrope walk because if it's better, there could be more obligations triggered, and we will have to rearrange the budget plan we have today. But if it goes down significantly from what we are projecting, we will have different issues to contend with. So the current estimate, though, with is we are planned to be balanced and structurally balanced over by the end of the multi-year. And again, a lot of one-time spending that is planned for the next several years.
So are you saying you're revising capital gains down because you believe they're going to fall, or are you just trying to be careful because
it's a similar forecasting methodology we've used for years, where we look at the level of capital gains and realize that a lot of that is predicated on what's happening in the stock market and what's happening with very wealthy individuals' portfolios of stocks. In California, and we have routinely brought that estimate down to account for the fact that that is an incredibly volatile part of our income tax base.
And finally, that energy reserve that the governor talked about, do you have any more details on where that energy might come from?
Sure. Let me get that. Yeah, so I mean, essentially the 8 billion is for a multi-pronged approach. The biggest piece is building a strategic reserve. So last year at the very end of the legislative session, the governor, we worked to get some peaker plants online through the Department of Water Resources. So we actually procured them and connected them to the State Water Project and to the electricity grid. There would be more of that done. That's one component. We're also looking to enter into contracts with some of the generation that's going offline so that we can keep that going for a little bit longer and only use it when it's absolutely needed, because the energy that's being decommissioned, these once-through cooling plants that are an old technology, not environmental friendly, we would want them to be able to be used just when we absolutely need it to avoid blackouts. And then, of course, we have other multiple strategies around deploying more quickly green technology as well as storage to help address. So it's a multi-pronged plan, including investing in additional solar that will directly benefit low-income customers as well. And I know there's a lot more detail. I'm sorry, I don't have it all in front of me. But.
Hi, Keely. Laura Mahoney with Bloomberg. We'll miss you. I guess I'll see you in the neighborhood. I'm a little confused about some revenue numbers in the general summary charts. Some of them look like revenue is actually projected to go down, and some of it is corporation tax. Maybe this touches on the capital gains discussion, but can you just explain why it looks like there's some projections that revenue is going down?
Yeah, so I mean, again, that's reflecting that in the current fiscal year, we brought our revenue estimate up significantly. And Jay Chamberlain is here. This is his last budget conference as well, because he's retiring. And after a wonderful career with the state, both at the franchise tax part and the department, he's taught me everything I know about this subject. But in terms of the current year, we revised our estimates up significantly because the cash was just coming in so much higher than we had projected just in early December when we finalized the budget numbers for January. Come January to now, the economy has actually gotten a bit more uncertain. The war in Ukraine, the inflation numbers persisting, the supply chain problems are persisting, and obviously the Federal Reserve being much more clear about the actions that they're taking to try and get a handle on inflation. All of those things together made it so our budget year forecast and beyond actually came down a bit. And so, yes, we do see capital gains really spiking in this current fiscal year, a lot based on the cash data that we saw coming in. But going forward, we see even more uncertainty around many different factors that could have a pretty significant impact on the state's revenues.
Thanks, and I'll miss Jay too. Is the salt cap workaround stuff all factored in here already?
Yeah,
so it's
yes.
It's baked into the numbers?
Well, we've made some assumptions because we don't have all the final tax data, but that's one of the things that we revised in this May revision, is a lot more people took advantage of that salt deduction workaround, and so our estimates were brought up significantly. Our corporate tax estimates were brought up significantly, and that's one factor. We have made an assumption that about half of the reduction in the income tax has already shown up, but that we're going to see another half of it later. So people have prepaid under the corporate tax, and some, we think, have adjusted their income tax already. Others, they will do that in their next quarterly filing. And so we've made an assumption. We've been pretty clear that we don't know what the right answer is, because we won't know that for another year when we have all the final tax data.
Thank you.
Hi, Keely. Laura Cordy from Politico. Thanks for taking questions. Hopefully this one isn't too wonky, but can you explain in detail how we avoided hitting the GAN limit with such a huge surplus? Like, what are we spending money on that we're avoiding that trigger?
I would love to answer that question. So let's just talk a little bit about where we were and where we are today. So we were at January, our estimate was that we were slightly above the limit by about 2.6 billion. And at May revision, that has flipped. And so I just want to talk a little bit about how we go through each process, January budget and May revision. So what we did since then was updated our economic and revenue forecasts. That went significantly up. However, it was offset because we took early action to reinstate the business tax credits that were limited during the pandemic. We then, based on that surge of revenues since January, we proposed new spending in the May revision. And just want to emphasize again that a lot of it is, we think, is from these spiking capital gains revenues. So most of the spending, 99% of the spending we proposed in May revision is one time and not ongoing. And that falls into three categories. The first that we've talked a lot about today, the governor talked a lot about, is the direct relief to taxpayers to address rising prices. The second is more spending on infrastructure, housing, broadband, deferred maintenance, school facilities, energy. And then the third is updated estimates of emergency spending due to COVID and drought. And under the rules of the GAN limit, this spending, these three categories that I just went through, they fall outside of what goes into the calculation. So taking all these factors together, the results flipped from January.
So am I right in understanding that that 18 billion inflation relief package helps avoid the GAN limit?
The $18 billion relief package that spending does not count against the limit. It's excluded from the limit.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Keely. This is Lindsay Holden from the SACB. Looking at the revised, it looks like the 65 million for care courts was for 2022, 2023, and then it looked like there was some ongoing funding. It looked like maybe around 50 million a year. Can you correct me if I'm wrong? Or
Yes. So care court, and just want to be clear that this is just the state department expenditures as well as the courts, the judicial branch. We're still working through with the counties the mandated activities that they have in that bill, and we are planning to fund those. We just didn't have a good estimate to build into the May revision. So that, I think, is important. I do believe there's probably some one-time costs that are accounted for. I believe there's some technical assistance that Department of Health Care Services will engage in to help the counties to implement this on the front end. And so while there are ongoing costs, some of them are just one-time startup costs.
Okay. Can you say how much will be ongoing?
I might ask for a help from one of my team members if they have that. Okay.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, we'll follow up. Sorry, we'll follow up.
All good. Also, in terms, I know, so the bonuses for basically it's just for healthcare workers and nurses, correct? It doesn't look like there's any.
It's for anybody that's working in a hospital setting or a nursing home. So it is beyond nurses. It would extend to janitors and others that work for the hospital system or nursing home.
Does that include any state workers, for instance, people working in prisons or state hospitals?
We are working through collective bargaining on payments that would also extend to those in similar settings in state facilities.
Okay, cool. And it doesn't sound like there are any other state employees who've worked in person throughout the pandemic who would get bonuses. It's pretty much just tied to healthcare workers, correct?
The proposal in January, that's beyond state government. This would extend to all hospitals, all nursing homes in the state.